About that. Death by overbooking. Does anybody know Trevor Noah? It's a Trevor Noah reference. Anyway, I mentioned in my previous presentation, for those of you who were there, that I'm really interested in this idea of knowing yourself. It's something that I feel passionate about. And so for the next half hour that I've got with you, I want to dive in a little bit more into this idea of knowing yourself as a way of inverting this asymmetry that we experience, that I believe we are faced with in the cybersecurity space. The quote is from Sun Tzu. It's very popular in the hacker space. I come from that space. That's how I got my start. And this is exactly the sort of thing that we like to say to each other. Sun Tzu quotes. I was joking with a colleague because he actually has a copy of the book, and I said to him, I think you might be the only one I know who actually has a copy. The rest of us just Google the quotes and then sort of try and develop life philosophies about them. And what's happened in security is this sort of thinking has prevailed, and particularly this idea of knowing your enemy, understanding what the adversary is up to. And companies like Mandiant, you'll remember with the APT report about 3 years ago, have made huge progress in the market by telling us, by enlightening for us, illuminating what the bad guy is doing, putting a face to that anonymous mask. And I think psychologically it connects with us in a very real way. We want to know who this guy is that we spend our day, fighting. And so this industry has emerged, this notion of intelligence-led security. And I had a laugh because I Googled intelligence-led security, and I found a site called intelligencesecurity.com, and their website says it's coming soon, which I thought sort of captured it. It's captured it exactly, like intelligence-led security is coming soon. Is it a term that you guys have heard, intelligence-led security? Yeah, is it something, it offends me, the term, because I can't understand it. So I'm sort of very aware of it, but I think maybe I'm sort of more aware of it than others. In any case, so intelligence-led security, as it's now found, the idea comes from the military space. The colonel who was moderating the earlier sessions was telling me this sort of know thy enemy is quintessentially military thinking, and we've adopted in cybersecurity, we're adopting more and more from the military space, and this idea of knowing your adversary and reconnaissance is getting bigger and bigger. But of course, cybersecurity at the moment is still an industry-governed space, right? We're led by vendors primarily. And so in our reality, what's happened is that this notion of intelligence security has sort of taken this form. And the rationale fundamentally is that we can predict the adversary's, the emergent rationale is that we can predict the adversary's behavior by looking at his past behavior, right? So we understand enough about what the adversary has done in the past. We can predict what he's going to do in the future. I say he in that sort of generic form. It might, of course, be a she. And then we can throw our resources, we can amass our forces to counter those specific things that we predict that the adversary is going to do. And of course, because we're industry-led and because we all are here to make a living, it takes the form of products, right? So we want to be able to sell something that captures this rationale, this notion. And the products generally take the form of what are called indicators of compromise, right? Which are little, they call them atomic data points, specific pieces of data about what the adversary is doing that can be shared and communicated and acted upon. And this IOC hierarchy of pain sort of captures what those different indicators are, with the tactics, techniques, and procedures up at the top there, sort of fundamentally understanding what the adversary does, how they think and how they work, being very difficult to capture and communicate, going all the way down to things like domain names and IP addresses and hash values, these atomic indicators, actually being relatively easy to capture and collate and communicate. And so what happens is these things here get commoditized, right? So now I can turn that stuff, because it's a list or a database or a feed or a platform, I can turn that into a product. And so our industry is seeing the emergence over the last sort of 2 years of a lot of technologies, services, data services in this space. And I just want to give you one example. This is a vendor who sells some of these atomic indicators as a data source to drive your intelligence-led security process. And I just want to show you this number. 1.2 billion devices are what they will inform you about on a monthly basis. And like the notion unsettles me because I'm not sure what me or my customers are supposed to do with 1.2 billion pieces of data about something. And so my team, I run a research team. My team did an analysis of the value of these kinds of data points in terms of driving intelligence-led security. So do they actually predict, do these 1.2 million devices, am I likely to actually see them attacking my network or my customer's network at any point? And so so let me skip over that. We designed this experiment where we basically turned our customers into a sort of a controlled experiment. We divided them into two groups, and we said, how likely is it that attackers that we see at one group of the customers will reappear later at another group of customers, right? A very simple test to check the fundamental notion behind this idea of intelligence-led security as it's manifest in that commoditized form. And so we said that basically, if we see, for example, if we see activity by one actor at one customer in one sector on day one, and we see activity from that actor in another sector on day two, that would be a successful prediction, right? That would affirm this idea that threat intelligence can predict future behavior. This is research that we'll be presenting at Black Hat in Asia later this month. And we tested this. We did an experiment over 6 months, sort of 1.3 billion data points that we looked at to try and test this idea. And our findings are really disappointing. Our findings are that only 3.5% of those atomic indicators will ever reappear at a different customer. So if I was buying 1.2 billion addresses as a form of a threat intelligence feed, I would expect less than 4% of them actually to ever touch my network. By contrast, if I put up my own honeypot for free on the internet, well, it cost me $50 a month, and I take those indicators and I look at them at my customer networks, then almost 15% of them will reappear, and that's for $50 a month. So my sense is that this idea of mapping the adversary, notionally it makes a lot of sense. It comes from the military, we understand it, it kind of catches us in the gut, but notionally I'm not sure that it actually holds out in the form that it's being sold to us. So going back to this idea of knowing your enemy, this is the bit that we're selling, this is the bit that the vendors are selling you. But I think that perhaps from this quote, it's the knowing yourself bit that we've got control over, where I say we can leverage that asymmetry to our advantage. And I want to suggest to you for the rest of the time that I've got, which I know is rapidly going to run out, that these are some things about yourself that I would encourage you to invest in. Things about understanding, things that allow you to leverage that asymmetry to your advantage. And I'm going to give you an example and just talk to each one of these points for the rest of the slide. And I want to start with knowing your footprint. The footprint is how you manifest, how you are exposed out onto the outside world, or internally, where your systems, where your users, where your people sit. What do you look like? And as I say, this is the thing that is most fundamentally yours. This is the thing that's the hardest for the attacker to figure out about you, and where you can leverage that asymmetry for your own benefit. So we have this notion, thinking about our systems of our environments as like a castle, with a boundary and a moat, and there's an inside and there's an outside. But I think we know today that this notion has died. It's gone. We are no longer defined by some kind of boundary. Right? The systems we protect are exposed in a myriad of ways, from mobile users to cloud systems to social media to physical dispersion. All of those things change this notion. And I want to remind you about Sony, who got hacked again and again. You might remember in 2012, Sony hacked again, almost became a meme back then. It was sort of like they were the laughing stock of the internet, and the feeling you had was like, can Sony just not get it right? Can they just not get on the front foot with being compromised over and over and over again? But if you look at how they were actually compromised at the time, then these are the domains where they were being hit. These are the places where they were being targeted. And effectively, what was happening is that the attackers were moving faster than Sony to understand Sony's footprint. And Sony kept focusing on, on their data center and their corporate firewalls and all of those things that they kind of felt represented that castle for them. And what the attackers were doing was saying, no, Sony is exposed in all these other places. Sites put up by marketing, sites put up by subsidiaries. All over the internet, Sony was being exposed. And the attackers were finding them and hitting them. If you look at how bug bounty programs work today, you'll see that the most successful bounty hunters, that's a thing, by the way. If you're not caught up, you can be a bounty hunter today. The thing that makes bounty hunters the most successful is the enumeration phase, is the ability to find those parts of the corporate system where the corporates haven't been looking. So footprinting is absolutely key. And I want to take a moment just to translate that into the internal systems too. I think the same principle applies internally. Until we understand where our IPs are, where our documents are, where our data sits, where our users are, what groups they're in, what privileges those groups have, I don't think we've got a chance of getting ahead of the adversary. I want to give a quick shout out to one of our vendors who helped us be here today by sponsoring, which is called Veronis, which I think is sort of subverting that thinking, which is taking a slightly different view, who start by saying, let's understand what we've got, where our files are, what permissions are assigned to those files, what users have got permissions to those files. That's, I think, a key element of knowing who you are, as opposed to trying to understand who the adversary is. The next thing we want to do is we want to understand our threat model. We live in an industry where people like me, who are paid by vendors, will stand up here and try and tell you what the problems are that you need to solve, because we know we've got solutions to those problems. Right? We've got things that we can sell you to fix those things. That's why we're up here. And what you need to do is you need to turn that around and start off by understanding what your problems are, and then look for the solutions to fix those. And I want to give you just an example of that, another piece of research my team did around what's called the Friday afternoon tax. It's a fraud scheme that's perpetrated against real estate agents, where late on a Friday afternoon, where everyone's sort of tired, maybe they've had a beer or two in, they run a social engineering attack effectively to get between the buyer and the seller of a property with the goal of changing the funds transfer, right? Having the payments made to the lots of people have lost lots of money because of these attacks. And we wondered in this research project whether that could be replicated in cyberspace. So we did a very simple reconnaissance activity, identified who the sort of top 5 or 10 realtors are in the UK, and then enumerated what their domains are. So what DNS domains do they use? And then we used a very simple SEO tool to generate what's called what are typos of those domains. So if somebody sits in front of a keyboard and they want to type securedata.com, they might type, or the gentleman who introduced me said I worked for SensePoint. I don't. I work for SensePost. But if he was emailing me, he might very easily and very naturally write SensePoint. So we register those domains, right, using free services or very cheap services. We register those domains. And with the registration of the domains, we register email servers also. So effectively, we're taking those domains for ourselves. We're attaching email servers behind them, and then we just wait. So a user who sits in front of a computer wants to send an email to a realtor using a domain that they have in their head. They type it down. They make one of those very predictable typos because the S and the P are close to each other on the keyboard or whatever the case is, and they accidentally send the email to the wrong person. Now, you might think that's unlikely, but across 40 domains in 6 weeks, we collected over 500,000 emails. 500,000, and I'm talking about 40 domains, 5 companies, 500,000 emails. And it took us about 3 weeks to get the kind of email that we wanted. So this is an email sent from one solicitor to a broker, typo in the email address saying, can we get in touch? We need to talk about how this transaction is going to happen. £3 million is involved. Now that guy sent me the mail. I can now respond, and I'm now man in the middle, if you like, between the realtor and the thing. So this kind of problem is how people are actually being hurt, right? Open S3 buckets on the internet is how people are actually being hurt. And if we think about our threat model, then we start recognizing these kinds of problems rather than the problems that the vendors tell you you've got because they've got a solution. So knowing your threat model is absolutely essential to knowing yourself. I think until we do that, we're not going to get ahead. The next thing I want to talk about is knowing your vulnerabilities. We saw this classic example with Equifax recently, simply hadn't patched. Known vulnerability, known fix, simply didn't get there, right? And we did a study recently. We've released a paper. It's on our site called Signals in the Noise. And one of the things we did is from our pen testing teams, we analyzed the data to see what we actually see. So we looked at about 500 penetration tests over the period of a year, and we could pull data from them to see, like, what are we actually seeing? And one of the things that we concluded is, on average, we will find within a customer network a directly exploitable vulnerability in under 3 days, is what it takes a pen tester to find something they can own on a network. And it's buoyed out again and again and again. Interestingly, if we look at the tests that were done against the same environment the second time, right, then that number jumps from 3.27, 3 something odd, to 21 days on average of work before we find an exploitable vulnerability. And the notion is very simple. You find those vulnerabilities, you action them, you patch them, you raise the cost for the attacker. I mean, it's a very, very fundamental and basic thing. But I think that notionally this holds out. It makes sense to do it. So knowing your vulnerabilities is another very important way to know yourself. If you're not doing it, and you're not doing it seriously, then you're missing a trick. The next thing you want to know is that something has gone wrong. I spoke about this in my previous presentation, so I'm going to be brief here. But I think we can accept that it's a question of not if, but when. And I know that's like, that's the catchphrase of the day, and it doesn't define everything. But I think it's a reality. And you want to ask yourself, when this thing happens, how do I not be that guy that gets told by my ISP after 170 days, that this malware has been active in my network? That's about the average dwell time at the moment for attacks that we know about, is 170 days before the enterprise becomes aware that the attack has happened. If you can just take that down from 170 to 30 days, you've done very, very well. And one of the ways, this is from the latest Verizon DBIR report. So 68% of all attacks that Verizon became aware of through their study took months to detect. The attacker, on the other side, compromise generally takes minutes. So we need to move this thing down this way, right, and get better at knowing when something has happened inside our environments. And as I said to you in the previous presentation, I think one of the ways we can do that is through deception. It's cheap, it's easy, it's high fidelity. Think about how you can put these sort of traps and triggers into your environments that would give you early indicator that something has happened. Right? It doesn't tell you much. It's not complex. You don't have to trick out the adversary with some sort of multi-phase thing. There's very simple, very reliable ways of doing this. I mentioned the one already, which is honey tokens, which you can plug into a SIEM, but you can also get, I get SMSs on my phone whenever one of these things triggers. And it's just enough for me to call up the SOC and say, hey, I saw this happen. Can somebody pull the logs? Can we have a look what's going on? All right, once you know that something has happened, once one of these things triggers, the bigger problem is then knowing what. Because if my honey document triggers or my honeypot triggers inside my environment, I know something is going wrong. I then have the very difficult process of triaging that. And for that, we need to have a more comprehensive visibility program in place. And I made some references to this in my previous presentation. There are a number of different technology platforms that will give us some of that. As I mentioned in my previous presentation, I think probably a detection program is going to need to leverage some combination of these. Each of these approaches, each of these technology paradigms has strengths and weaknesses. And I feel pretty convinced that where we stand now with technology, none of these buzzword solutions are going to fundamentally make the problem go away for us. The ML thing I could talk about for ages. I think it's great. I think we're making great progress. But there are fundamental challenges to applying the notion of ML to information security, which is going to limit its effectiveness. Endpoint, this whole sort of EDR space, the sort of carbon black and those technologies, they're great. They give us something we never had before. But there are fundamental weaknesses to the notion of how they work, which means they're not on their own a solution. So it's probably some kind of combination of those things. What I think is more important is that we have an awareness of what part of the attacker's kill chain that technology tells us something about. So in our space, we apply what we call the diamond model. And the diamond model basically has a sort of a stack shape to it. And for every part of the stack, we look at what data is available to us that could tell us something about the behavior of an attacker doing some kind of attack. And so what we can then do is we can map that out and get a picture of what our entire sort of visibility program looks like. Right? So what do we know about denial of service? What do we know about phishing? What do we know? What can we hope to see about malware and ransomware type attacks? And what data sources do we have that are telling us that thing? And once we think about it like this, we can start doing other things like testing. Now I can develop targeted tests, even like in a unit test way, using automation frameworks that can hammer those things and say, am I actually seeing this behavior when it happens on our networks? But it needs a sort of systematized approach. And I mentioned that one of the big advantages we've got now is the emergence of this attack framework, which really, it's not complete, it's not comprehensive, it's still in the early days. But I'd really encourage you, if you're thinking about detection in your space, to have a look at this program, because it helps you think about where you need to have visibility, what kinds of things you should be looking to detect. And remember, one of the things that makes this cyber kill chain, that's this breakdown at the bottom here, what makes it powerful is this notion that you disrupt the chain. You don't have to see or stop everything in the chain. You only have to break one link, right? So in some ways, it's a very liberating idea. You can say, well, for a typical malware APT-style attack, I really am not going to see reconnaissance. I'm probably not going to see the exploitation phase. Probably not going to see installation, because that's by definition where they get past us every time. But when they start talking to their command and control servers or exfiltrating data or performing actions on target, that I've got a good chance of seeing. And these are the mechanisms that I'm going to put in place to see those things. And it means accepting that you're going to be blind over here and perhaps focusing your attention over there, but you can do it with deliberateness and you can test. And finally, I want to talk to you very briefly about process around that. And I'm not going to go into the details of this, but I want to put it to you that if you want to have visibility, you need to have two kinds of processes. The one is a reactive process. So going back to my analogy of scanning the bags, right? You need to do that. You need to watch every bag that comes past. You need to ensure that you can do that. But just as importantly, anyone in intelligence, in sort of counterterrorism today will tell you that those bag checkers are not going to stop the bad guy. What stops the bad guy is proactive intelligence gathering, right? Is going out to understand what the bad guy is doing and look for him in those places and sort of preempt the attack. So your processes need to have both of those elements. You need to have the routine, reliable, reactive stuff, and you need to have something that's proactive. This is generally referred to as threat hunting. But again, be specific. Threat hunting means many things to many people. All right. Then the next thing, and I don't have much to say about this, but the next thing we see increasingly in our space, because we have a detection service, is that we can tell our customers that something has gone wrong, but the customers very often, they're not in a position to respond to that. They don't know what they're going to do. And generally what happens is the customer then takes an affected machine and they re-image it and they carry on. And that cuts off all your visibility about what that attack could have meant, what its impact is, where it came from, what the risk to you is. So we know that these things are going to happen, and I think businesses are not spending enough time and energy thinking about how you will respond when something happens. And I'm not just talking disaster recovery. I'm talking about the whole life cycle, from triage, impact assessment, incident response, forensics, all of those things. You need to have that stuff in place. You're going to get the call sometime. Someone's going to tell you this has happened. And I'll tell you something else about this. We hear about the big stories, right? We hear about the FBI calling whoever and saying, you guys have got an APT all over your network. You've been owned by the Russians. It only happens like that 1 in 100 times. What happens the other 99 times is someone says, I saw this funny thing. We saw this machine talking out to that machine. And that doesn't seem quite right. And is that activity that you would expect? And you have people logging in at that time of night. And what that requires from you is work, people in place, who can respond, data that you can access to do that investigation, an ability to isolate a machine while you do the investigation without too fundamentally disrupting the user while they work. It's those small indicators that you need to be able to respond to, not just the big, okay, it's now happened thing. It's the little ones. It's a war of attrition. All right. Then the next thing I would say to you is I think it's very useful to know how it really feels. Practice. Practice getting attacked. And practice it end to end. So, with proper gloves off pen tests, with your response teams in place, with a sort of a goal orientation to the attack. Get pen testers in that will say to you, that will try and do specific things, affect specific goals within your environment, that touch on the core of your business, right? Not just enumerating vulnerabilities, that's part of it, but I'm talking about a really aggressive exercise. And I love this analogy from Tyson. I think it's absolutely true. Everyone's got a plan. You think you know how it's going to go until somebody actually hits you, and your head is spinning, and your nose hurts, and you feel very offended, and your arms don't want to come up, and your feet aren't moving as fast as you thought they would. And the way you get used to being hit in the face is by getting out there in the ring with the sparring partner and letting them punch you a little bit. That's how you get sort of battle ready. And so I'm a very strong believer in this. I would really encourage you to do it. We did it recently, and we did something a little bit differently. We have a pen testing team, and we've started publishing those findings against our network. So we have reports that come out that say, we did this engagement, these were the goals of that engagement, this is what the guys saw. And the first thing that's very, very distressing and concerning for us as a security company is that the pen testing teams get it right almost every time. All right? Now, in fairness, we test from a post-breach position, so we have the attacker already inside the network, and then they have some goal that they're trying to pursue. And the truth is, they get it right in exactly the same way they get it right for our customers. Within a few days, they found something, one machine, one user, one misconfiguration somewhere, and they're leveraging that, and boom, 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 they're moving laterally across our network, and they have what they need. It's a horrible experience. I promise you, it's a horrible experience. Nobody likes it. But the good thing is we also get to exercise our detection and our response capabilities. And the bright side is I now know that when attackers behave in that way, I can see it. And the things that I didn't see the first time, I can now improve my detection capabilities and I can see them the next time. The other thing that's really encouraging is I just yesterday distributed the response tracker for the last exercise. We did the last exercise like October last year to everyone who's involved. So now everyone involved knows these were the places where we fell short. These are the actions we've taken to remediate those things. Everyone's on board. They take it seriously. Everyone's learning. We're getting better. We're getting better all the time. So I'm a real believer in this. I would encourage you strongly. Look at that. Take the gloves off. Let somebody go at you. And that, people, is all I have time for. Thank you very much. I don't know if there's a few minutes for questions or the next speaker is on. No? All right. Cool. Thanks.